Okay, so last session we went through. Okay, so last session went through an overview of the lives of the four Khulafa. So after the Prophet passed away in the year, which year? 11 AH. So the Prophet passed away 11 AH in Medina, 11th year after Hijrah. So he spent how many years in Mecca? 13 years. Okay, so he spent 13 years in Mecca and 10 or so years in Medina. And he passed away in 11th year after Hijrah. And then Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu became the Khalifa, who ruled for how many years? 2 years, 3 months and 10 days. Okay, so then he passed away in the 13th year of Hijrah. And then Umar radiallahu anhu, his reign started. And he ruled for how many years? 10 years. So he ruled for 10 years. And so he passed away when he was killed while he was leaving Fajr Salah in the 23rd year after Hijrah. So it's during Umar radiallahu anhu's reign, generally most of the conquests they happened. So the reign of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was consolidation, fighting those who left Islam and the false prophets. And right at the end of his life, that's when the armies were started to be sent out against the Romans and the Persians. And it's in the time of Umar radiallahu anhu that the main battles took place. Okay, so just continuing. So in the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, who was Khalifa for 10 years. So from the 13th, let's see if you guys can just stay a bit back so you don't make sure you're not on the record. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so Umar radiallahu anhu's time, so he ruled for about 10 years, and that was a period of expansion. That's when the Persian Empire basically was more or less reduced to nothing. And then you had the Roman Empire, whose military might basically was turned into half. So he ruled for 10 years until the 23rd year after Hijrah. And then took over Uthman radiallahu anhu. How many years did Uthman radiallahu anhu rule for? Any of you guys know? Yeah, so he ruled for 12 years. And so the beginning part of Uthman radiallahu anhu's rule, which we all discussed all this last lesson, was the first Uthman radiallahu anhu's rules were divided into two halves. First 6 years and the later 6 years. First 6 years was the 6 years of rising continuously. So there was some expansion, not much. First expansion that took place that had never happened before in time, apart from this time. What type of expansion? To where? Oh, that started in time of Abu Bakr, right at the end. So what did you say?
Cyprus,
yes. Yeah, this was the first expedition on sea, yeah, which hadn't happened before. So they were conquering the nearby lands in the Persian. So you had Iraq and Iran, and then you had towards Sham. So you had the Iraq and Iran towards the northeast. Yeah, and then you had towards the northwest, I believe. And so Sham, Palestine was conquered in time of Umar radiallahu anhu. Then you had Damascus. Then you had all these Sham, basically the Roman Empire. Yes, and the first time in Uthman radiallahu anhu's time, that's when Cyprus, they built boats and they started a navy, and that was under the instruction of Muawiyah radiallahu anhu. So that was for 12 years, and then he was assassinated by the Kharijis. And then who ruled?
Ali
radiallahu anhu was the Ali radiallahu anhu ruled for how many years?
Just under 5 years.
Just under 5 years, yes. Yeah, so just under 5 years, Ali radiallahu anhu ruled. Yeah. Yeah, no, she was here last lesson. That's why. Yeah, so Ali radiallahu anhu ruled just under 5 years, and there was no expansion in his reign. That's because he was dealing with internal problems. So there were civil wars, Kharijis, and different stuff. But anyway, so last lesson was just an overview on the period of the Khulafa Rashidin, and that's because after the period of the Khulafa Rashidin, that's when the madhabs really started to form. To understand how the madhabs were formed, you need to understand background behind it. So that's why we went through the history. Last lesson was purely based on history, and there's no fiqh involved. And in the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, mentioned last time, is that his policy was, what did the you guys want here, was Umar radiallahu anhu's special policy about the Sahaba?
They stay in Medina.
Yes. So the elite of the Sahaba, they had to reside in Medina and Hijaz, that Medina Makkah area. Why? To keep them unified. And number two is because imagine how quickly the empire, the Arab conquests are taking place. Yeah, it's unprecedented. Imagine within, let's say, including Abu Bakr's reign, 2.5 years, Umar 10 years. In 12.5 years, they've conquered the Persian Empire and half of the Roman Empire. So that amount of land so quickly, there's going to be so many new issues that they need to deal with. So who's Umar going to make mashwara with? Yeah. So that's why he needs to have the elite of the companions. And that's why when the people of Kufa complained that we don't have any we need teachers, and Umar wrote to the people of Kufa, I'm preferring you over myself by sending you Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, because I wanted him with me for mashwara, but he's one of the greatest companions, but I'm going to send him to you because I preferred you over myself, which is basically going to form the foundation of the Hanafi madhab, this decision of Umar radiallahu anhu. So that's why these key background things are very important. And then Uthman radiallahu anhu came into power. Then he was much more lenient. Umar radiallahu anhu was a very stern person. He had his very strict policies. Uthman radiallahu anhu is complete opposite. So it's very soft, lenient, laid back. So whoever wanted to go is like, Bismillah, go. Yeah. So that's when the Sahaba, they started scattering. So during the reign of Umar radiallahu anhu, because so many elite of the Sahaba there, imagine the knowledge that would have been being transmitted within Makkah and Medina. Yeah, so many Sahaba, the Tabi'in is literally like a gold mine for the Tabi'in. They've got so much hadith, everything basically there. Okay, so that was last lesson. And in the previous lessons, we've discussed why there's differences of understanding verses of the Quran. So far, we discussed why there's different interpretations of the hadith. We've discussed why there's apparent contradictory hadith. One hadith saying halal, one saying haram. So we discussed all these preliminary issues that generally cause a lot of confusion. And now we're going into a bit more of a historical aspect, and we're going to come back to these preliminary issues after we've dealt with a few of the preliminary stages. Yeah, so after, because we haven't finished that topic. So now this lesson, let me just share my other screen. Okay, so this lesson we're going to start off by talking about Ahlul Rai or Ashabul Rai and Ashabul Hadith. So this so in our lessons, the four madhabs, they do not exist yet. Right now, we're still in the stage now after the Khulafa Rashidin period. So the Ali radiallahu anhu's reign ended in which year? Anyone know? These are questions, huh? Yeah?
TAH.
Yeah, 40 AH. Yeah, so the Ali radiallahu anhu's reign ended at 40 AH. This is when the formation of madhab starts. Yeah, not formation of madhabs, but the background of the formation starts from now. Okay. So now within the Sahaba, you had diverse methodologies, mindsets, because obviously two human beings, they do not think the same way. Yeah. So within the Sahaba, you had many different mindsets. Like let's say the later jurists would warn people that beware of the Shada'id Umar, that beware of the stern rulings of Umar, wa Rukhas ibn Abbas, and beware of the lenient rulings of Ibn Abbas. So some Sahaba were very lenient, some Sahaba were very strict. They had different mindsets, different mentalities, how to approach different scenarios. Yeah.
So you're saying the formation of madhabs happened in Ali radiallahu time, yeah? Which was
no, I mean this is
like the foundation for it. Kind of
foundation even happened, even it was there from the Khulafa Rashidin time. It's just the further we get, as the more years that go by, the foundation gets stronger and stronger and stronger.
40 AH, which means there's a gap of 20 something years.
Yes, remember.
Passed away, right?
Yeah, but 30.
30 years. Okay, so then the formation of it happened literally quite close to some.
To really understand this, you need to have watched the last session. Yeah, because there's no gap. It's just a continuation after. But we're going to go through this now. Anyway, we're going to go through a lot of this, and you'll get answered. Okay, so basically, within the time of the Sahaba, although the distinction wasn't too great, but the distinction was there there were some Sahaba that would not give their own opinion at all. If they're asked a question, they look for a hadith. If they find a hadith, they'll narrate the hadith to you. And if they don't know a hadith, they say, I don't know a hadith on this, go ask someone else. Yeah. So you had that very strict hadith-based approach within Sahaba. Some Sahaba, they're like, okay, you know what? Let's use our logic. Let's come to a conclusion on this. If we know some hadiths, alhamdulillah, we'll use the hadiths. If we don't, we'll form our own opinions. So you had these sort of understandings within the Sahaba. So Umar radiallahu anhu was one of those companions who would always he was bold in giving his own opinions. Even when the Prophet was alive, he would always give his own opinions. So, and many times, and because of Umar radiallahu anhu's mindset, many Quran verses actually came down in conforming to the opinion of Umar radiallahu anhu. Let's say it was Umar radiallahu anhu actually suggested hijab. Before the hijab was fard, Umar radiallahu anhu said to the Prophet that many types of men come to your house. I think it'd be more appropriate if you commanded her to do hijab, meaning to veil between her and the men. And literally afterwards, the command of hijab came down. So Umar radiallahu anhu thought of it. It's not that Allah listened to Umar. No, it's that this was going to be revealed anyway. But Umar radiallahu anhu, because of his foresight, he had already thought of it as well. Yeah. And likewise, the Umar radiallahu anhu said at one point that I think it would be good if you take the Maqam Ibrahim, outside the Kaaba, that place, and make it a place of prayer. And then Allah revealed the verse, وَاتَّخِذُوا مِن مَقَامِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ مُصَلَّى, that make the Maqam of Ibrahim a place of prayer. So there's many incidents like this. Even in Battle Badr, the Prophet asked Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu for his opinion, and the Prophet liked Abu Bakr's opinion and he acted upon that. And Umar radiallahu anhu's opinion was completely opposite, and a very stern one. And Allah revealed a verse rebuking the Prophet and that they should have gone with Umar's opinion. Yeah, so Umar radiallahu anhu had a lot of foresight, and he wouldn't be scared to give his own judgment. But the Tabi'in, they describe him as sometimes he would spend an entire month pondering over one issue, and sometimes he would give 100 verdicts in one gathering. Yeah, so Umar radiallahu anhu was basically very bold in giving his own opinions and judgment and things like that. So, and one of his, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he was a great companion, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and he would generally follow in everything Umar radiallahu anhu would do. And when the day that Umar passed away, so I'm just going through these notes now. So the day that Umar radiallahu anhu passed away, he said that 9/10 of knowledge has gone. So this is how much he looked up to Umar and how much he thought of Umar radiallahu anhu's knowledge. And whenever Umar radiallahu anhu gave his own fatwa or verdict, he would never oppose Umar radiallahu anhu. So basically whatever Umar does, that's what Abdullah ibn Mas'ud does. And he himself says that if the entire mankind walked through one valley and Umar radiallahu anhu walked through another, I would walk with Umar radiallahu anhu because of his greatness. Basically no one can match Umar in his knowledge. And Sha'bi, one famous tabi'i, he says that if basically Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, he would not do qunut. Meaning he didn't see it as a sunnah. And if Umar did it, Abdullah Mas'ud would have done it. But because Umar didn't do it, that's why Abdullah Mas'ud, basically taqleed, following Umar radiallahu anhu, whatever he does. But saying that he did differ with Umar radiallahu anhu in many masail as well. And Ibrahim al-Nakhai. Anyone who Ibrahim al-Nakhai is? I'm going to ask you all these questions, so you need to be listening. Do you know who Ibrahim al-Nakhai is? Who's Ibrahim al-Nakhai? Anyone?
Is he from Kufa?
He is from Kufa, yes? No, he's teacher now. He's
teacher of Abu Hanifa.
Yes, teacher's teacher. Yeah? Teacher's teacher of Imam Abu Hanifa. So he's one of the main tabi'is. So he would say that if Umar and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud agreed on something, then he would always take their opinion. But if they disagreed, he would take Ibn Mas'ud's. Why? Umar wasn't more knowledgeable. Why did he take Ibn Mas'ud's? Because Umar radiallahu anhu's rulings were more harsh. So he'd prefer the softer opinion. So he'd go with Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Okay. So basically, what happened was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he went to Kufa. In whose time? Should be an easy question. When did Abdullah ibn Mas'ud go to Kufa? Umar radiallahu anhu's time. Remember, people complained to Umar, and Umar wrote back to them, "I prefer you over myself." Yeah. So Abdullah ibn Mas'ud went to Kufa during the reign of Umar radiallahu anhu. And before that, which main companion was in Kufa?
Oh, you said that. When he said,
I didn't mention it today.
No.
Ali radiallahu anhu. Yeah. So Ali radiallahu anhu, he was in Kufa. Why? Why was he in Kufa? What was he doing there? Fishing. Now, when he became the Khalifa, he moved the capital from Medina to Kufa. Yeah, so he moved the entire Islamic capital. So that became the capital of basically governance, where he was governing the Islamic Empire from. Yeah.
So that was after he become Khalifa, right?
Yeah.
He went to Kufa during Umar.
No, I said before Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Actually, sorry, yeah, I phrased the question. Yeah, after Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, it was Ali radiallahu anhu. So he was there. Yeah, so these two great companions were Ali radiallahu anhu and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Yeah.
Ali went during Umar.
No. Ali radiallahu became Khalifa. Yeah. He moved the capital there. Yeah. Okay, so these two, and obviously there was some books that actually mentioned there were 1,000 Sahaba there. Yeah, so that Kufa became a learning spot with so many Sahaba, so many great tabi'in are there, and knowledge is spreading. Especially they've got one of the greatest companions, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and we're going to go through the biography of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and why he was so special. So to understand the Hanafi fiqh, we need to understand who Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was, because he was the main teacher there, and those people who passed down knowledge were his main students. Okay, so basically Kufa became the madrasa of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. So their main two people, there was Ali radiallahu anhu, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. But I don't know to what degree this is true, but many scholars, when they write on this, they say generally Hijaz, Makkah, Medina would have more hadith available to them than probably Iraq. Because obviously, yes, in comparison to Iraq, there would have been a lot more Sahaba in Makkah and Medina. So hence there would have been a lot more knowledge in terms of hadith available there. Okay. So, and in Kufa, there were Persian converts that were becoming Muslims. So there would have been a lot more new challenges in Iraq, rather than Makkah and Medina, where life is simple, everyone's praying their 5 times salah and, learning, teaching, studying. They're all Arabs, they're all Muslims, and, just life is just continuing as it was in the time of the Khulafa Rashidin or in time of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. There's not really new challenges, but Iraq, it's so many new converts are coming in. And that was actually the hotspot for the Kharijis, the rebels that assassinated Uthman. They were Muslims, but they had their own sect now. And that was actually the hotspot was Iraq. That's where they used to gather. That's where all these things came out from. Even the Shia, their hotspot was Iraq as well. So that when the movement started that the family of Ali should be in power. So a lot of these fitan actually coming from Iraq as well. So the Persian in Iraq, they had a lot more challenges. And so now what happened was, because Umar he had that mindset of constantly giving fatwa, even Abdullah Mas'ud same, and so on. So this trend it continued within the jurists of Iraq, where they would be asking hypothetical scenarios. If this happened, what would be the ruling? If that happened, what would be the ruling? And they became famous. That's why they're called Ahlul Rai. Ahlul Rai means the people of opinion. So because they'll be constantly exercising their own opinion. If this was to happen in a hypothetical scenario, what would be the ruling? Yeah, and that's what they were famous for. In Arabic, the way you phrase this is "Ara'aita." What do you think, or what is your opinion? And they were actually a derogatory term that people started calling them was "Ara'aitiyin." These are the people who keep saying "Ara'aita." What is your opinion? Yeah, so that was like a label that was given to them because they're constantly asking, "What's your opinion?" And there was a scholar in Medina. I believe he's one of the teachers of Imam Malik. He was inclined to these sort of hypothetical scenarios, constantly asking, delving into these sort of issues. And when he kept on asking these sort of questions, Sa'id ibn Musayyab, one of the great tabi'in there, I'm going to learn about him later, basically they said, "Are you one of the Iraqis?" Basically, whenever someone will ask a lot of questions, they'll be labeled an Iraqi. You know how when someone's doing something, you label them or something? So that became a label. And like what Ashab did, one famous student of Imam Malik is in which city? Medina. Yeah. So one of the famous students of Imam Malik, his name was Asad ibn al-Furat. And what happened was people wouldn't ask, because I'm going to go into this shortly, but basically there are two camps, two main learning centers. One was in Iraq, who are famous for, what are they famous for? Asking questions and opinions, yeah. And the other main center of learning was Medina. And they were a lot more strict hadith based, don't ask too many questions. They will never get into hypothetical scenarios. If basically a new occurrence actually happens, then we look for a hadith in it. If it doesn't happen, we're not going to discuss it at all. So they're very strict in terms of text base. So imagine you as a student, you want to know these sort of random questions that come to you, isn't it? But the students would not ask Imam Malik random question. He'd get annoyed. So, what is this? But there was one student that came from, I believe he came from Morocco or Spain or Tunisia. Or I think he might be in Tunisian, I think. He basically came from that region. And what happened, because he came from so far, Imam Malik, he was a bit softer on him. So, and he would actually entertain his questions. So all the other students, they would tell Asad ibn al-Furat, ask Imam Malik these questions today. And he would ask and Imam Malik would answer. And one day Imam Malik got a bit fed up. Because if you want to keep asking questions, I didn't go to Iraq. That's what they're known for. You go over there. I don't want to answer your questions. Basically got fed up one day. And Asad ibn al-Furat thought to himself, you know what? Good idea. So he left Imam Malik and went to Iraq and studied with Imam Muhammad, Imam Abu Hanifa student. But anyway, that's a long story, and he was basically, Asad ibn al-Furat was one of the foundations of the Maliki school forming, but we'll get to that later. Okay, so we have the school, the madrasa of Kufa. Who was the main Sahabi there? Ali and
Mas'ud.
Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Yeah, Ali was, yes, he was one of the most knowledgeable people there, but in terms of teaching, he didn't do that much. Imagine he's a Khalifa, he's got so many things to do. He's not going to be sitting in the masjid all day teaching. He's got, so many things to do, yeah? So the main teacher was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. And the Kufa was known as the madrasa of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. And these things that they were known for. And they would narrate less hadith as well, in comparison to the people of Makkah and Hijaz. Okay, so this is still very early on regarding time the Sahaba and then the generation after them. Okay, so then you have the madhab or the school of Hijaz. Hijaz is by the Makkah and Medina area. So we call that area Hijaz. So it was the abode of Khilafah for a very long time. The first three Khulafa, it was a meeting point of the Sahaba. So imagine all the Sahaba, they would do Umrah, isn't it? Yeah, the Muslims would be doing Umrah, the Sahaba would be doing Umrah, they'd be doing Hajj every year. So they'd always be gathering. And when scholars gather, they don't just start talking about football. Yeah, they're going to start talking about knowledge. So that was the place of also transmitting knowledge, gaining knowledge. That's why many scholars in those days, they would do Hajj, not to actually perform Hajj, to meet scholars and gain knowledge. So going for Hajj was basically a travel for knowledge in those days. So there's a lot of hadith there, a lot of athar, statements of the Sahaba, the fatwas of the Sahaba, and so on. And in Medina, we're going to come, there was Abdullah ibn Umar, the son of Umar radiallahu anhu. He was there. Zayd ibn Thabit was there. Aisha radiallahu anha was in Medina. The great Sahaba were in Medina, and their knowledge was basically passed on to Medina. We're going to go into these in a lot more detail afterwards. I'm just trying to go through the difference between the people of right, the people of opinion, and the people of hadith. Okay, so now what was different to them, the people of Hijaz? So what if they were asked a question, they would very, very, basically they wouldn't give their own opinions. Yeah, if they knew a hadith, they'd narrate it. If they didn't, they'd say, I don't know, until they found a hadith about it. So for example, someone asked Salim ibn Abdullah ibn Umar, he's one of the main jurists of Medina, a question, and he said his response was, I don't know a hadith on this. And then the person said to him, just give me your opinion. That's all I need. Give me your opinion. You're one, is basically the greatest scholar, yeah, or if not one of the greatest scholars in Medina. And he's saying, I don't know hadith on this. And the other question says, give me your opinion. He says no. And his reasoning was, imagine if I give he would have had his own opinion, but he refused to give it. So his reasoning was, imagine if I give you my opinion today, and opinions, they're not set in stone. They can change. Like if it changes and you're doing the wrong thing, imagine if I can't find you 10 years later and my opinion changes, then who's going to answer for me in the day of judgment? So they had that sort of mindset. So they wouldn't use opinion unless it was absolutely necessary. That's when they would give their own opinion. It's like a life and death situation. You know how we're allowed to eat pig when it's necessary? For them, that's using the opinion was the same thing. Okay, and they had a lot more companions in Hijaz. Life was very simple. They disliked hypothetical questions, or even looking for the reason for this. You know how sometimes you have a ruling and we're like, okay, but what's the reason behind this ruling? We ask that, isn't it? Yeah, because we want to make sense of it. And once you know the reason, you can apply it to other situations, isn't it? Yeah. They would not look into the reasons of things. They say, this is the command. That's it. We don't need to know anything else. We just need to follow it. Yeah, but the Iraqis were completely opposite. They'd look for all the Masail and think, okay, what's the reason for this? What's the reason for this? What's the reason for this? And they'll come up with about 100 scenarios based upon that reason. So now that we know the reason, if this were to happen, this would be the ruling. If this were to happen, this would be the ruling. If you actually look at Imam Muhammad's books, let's say Asal over there, that really long one over there, the whole book is, every sentence starts with Ara'ita. What is your opinion on? If this was to happen, then, and then he gives, then once that's answered, but what if that were to happen? The whole book starts with, what is your opinion? Yeah, question and answers, the entire book. Okay, so their reliance was completely in the hadith and athar, basically the statements of the Sahaba. And basically there was competition from both sides. So it wasn't like, you know, everything's very jolly. They criticized them, because of the people of Iraq, they thought our methodology is better. We're the ones that are preserving fiqh. We're the ones that actually understand fiqh. We're going into all these sorts. And these guys, they don't know any fiqh. They just know anything hadith. Yeah. So the Iraqis thought their methodology was better. And because imagine the reason why Iraqis were doing this, because they had so many new challenges, isn't it? And imagine all these people and there's no hadiths on this. So what are they supposed to do? They can't just say, no, we don't have any answers for you, go back. No, this is very impractical. So they saw the bigger picture. So hence, Kufa became the most advanced in terms of fiqh in the time. Yeah, even much more advanced than Medina. So there was a bit of animosity between both sides. So in the time of Sahaba, these two mindsets were there, but it wasn't so distinct. And as time went on, it became more and more distinct. So the people of Medina basically saw that in preserving religion, we need to stick closely to the hadith and the fatwa of the Sahaba. And Iraq saw the opposite. To preserve religion, we actually need to start using our own opinion and come up with rulings and things. So we need to understand the Sharia by using our own opinion. So they had two different mindsets, and they both are doing for the sake of Allah. Okay, so I'm just going to skip some of this stuff. Yeah, so the Iraqis were called the people of opinion. That doesn't mean they didn't use hadith. Yes, they knew thousands. They knew a lot of hadith. It's just that they exercised their opinion more. A lot. That's why they were just labeled as a people of opinion. And the people in Medina, they also used logic. Obviously, you can't like completely abandon logic. It's just that they relied on hadith a lot more than their own opinion. That's why they're called the people of hadith. So in the time of the Tabi'in, that's when fiqh, they started to slowly become codified. Whereas, so in every city, you had the major Sahaba. Okay. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so in each of these cities, you had major Sahaba, and then you had their students who would learn from them, and they they preserved the fiqh and the knowledge of the Sahaba. And so let's say Ibn Mas'ud, he taught in Kufa. Yeah. So now the people of Kufa, who would they think that is the most knowledgeable of the companions? They would think our teacher Abdullah Mas'ud, he's the most knowledgeable of all the companions. Unless the people in Medina, they studied with, let's say, Abdullah ibn Umar and Aisha and Zayd ibn Thabit. They would automatically think our teachers, they are the most knowledgeable. Yeah, so everyone basically relied on their own teachers to be the most knowledgeable. Okay, I'm just skipping a few of these things. Okay, so there was quite a bit of animosity between the two camps, by the way. Yeah, one problem that happened within the camp of Iraq, and this became a very, very big problem. I'm not going to go into it now. It's basically the createdness of the Quran. And this is why Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he went through that torture from 3 or 4 Khalifas. Yeah. So they're basically the notion that started, is the Quran created or not? Yeah. We say as Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, we believe that the Quran is eternal. It's one of the sifat of Allah, and it's a speech of Allah, and it's eternal. Just how Allah's being is eternal, the Quran is eternal. But another group came out by saying, no, the Quran is not eternal, it's created. Yeah. So this was like some random debate that started, but this became a big thing. Saying, because the Hadith scholars were saying, whoever says either they're doing takfir on them, they're not Muslim. Whoever says the Quran is created, they're not Muslims, or they're basically innovators, and so on and so on. So the problem started was many people from Iraq are saying it. Now, when people are from your locality are saying it, everyone gets labeled with the same label, isn't it? So then so basically the people of Hijaz, now they have another point over the people of Iraq. They're all innovators because they all believe in the createdness of the Quran. And not just that, even like many of Imam Abu Hanifa's students actually were proponents of this. So they had like a direct link to, so imagine if your student is saying something, they automatically raises fingers over the teacher. Yeah. Another thing that the people of Iraq would do is they use stratagems. So because they were always hypothetically thinking, now and basically that's why in Hanafi fiqh books, you find an entire chapter dedicated to stratagems, how to get out of things, legal ways, legal loopholes, basically. Yeah. So let's say, like, basically there's whole chapters, by the way, in Hanafi fiqh books dedicated to this. So I don't know, it's just stuff like, some are good and some obviously, bad. Let's say zakat is fard on you once a year, isn't it? Yeah. So once you've had that money for an entire year, at the end of the year, that money becomes fard. So you have to give zakat on that money. What if I don't want to give zakat, and just one day before my year comes, I give all my money to my wife? So on my zakat date, I don't have any money. So do I have to give zakat? No, I don't have any money. That's a stratagem, isn't it?
What's the example of a good strategy that you said?
I can't think of one right now from the top of my head.
Exactly.
Good strategy, they would fall under, let's say someone makes an oath. Every time I enter my house, my wife is divorced. And oaths are binding.
Yeah.
So now how do you get out of that? So they think of loopholes to, okay, you know what, do this and do that, then to annul your oath, because oaths are binding, by the way. So if someone actually made an oath, every time I look at you, you are divorced. Now every time you look at your wife, she would actually be divorced. Yeah. So someone actually makes an oath by saying, every time I marry, my wife is divorced. You're finished. So make sure you guys don't make that oath. Yeah. So basically they were known for that. And so basically the people of Makkah and Medina, what they're going to say about them? They're going to say, these guys, they're making halal and haram, and they're changing the religion based on their opinion. So these are basically labels upon labels and labels. And then you have to imagine as well, communication is very less. So all it takes is one person say something about them, that's it, spread everywhere like wildfire. Yeah. So they would be accused of abandoning hadith in favor of their own opinion. But what happened, a lot of these issues would be resolved. And let's say when Imam Abu Hanifa would go to Makkah to do Hajj, then he'd actually talk to them. Then they'd realize, you know what, these people are just like us. Yeah, they're just faced with a lot more scenarios than we are. Yeah, so there's many instances when Imam Hanifa goes to Hajj, then someone says, okay, don't go to Abu Hanifa because he prefers qiyas over his own, over hadith. Then Imam Abu Hanifa, he says, okay, come sit with me and ask me questions. And then they realize, you know what, there's nothing wrong with him. Yeah, so that a lot of this stuff does get thingy, but obviously that's your conversation. One person is going to change what entire country thinks about you. Okay, and another thing about the Ashab al-Hadith is generally, this was a bit later on. You know how the people of Iraq, they were very centered on fiqh, and they used to have, let's say, a separate teacher to learn hadith from, to narrate hadith, to memorize hadith from, and they'd go to a separate teacher who's a master in fiqh to teach them just fiqh, not hadith. Whereas the other approach, the hadith approach, they had one teacher, and their style of teaching was a teacher would come and just narrate hadith to you. Now it's up to you, understand what you want to understand. That was this. They didn't have any separate training in fiqh. So you can understand from that is they're going to be a lot more behind in terms of understanding and fiqh of technical matters and things like that. So basically, so anyway, so going back to the main thing. So if you just, as long as you take away this, then that's good enough, is that in right from the earlier stages, there were two main centers of learning. The first one was The most advanced one in fiqh was
in Medina. As in,
Iraq.
the most advanced center of learning.
Yeah, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud said
Yeah. Which town?
in Kufa,
In Kufa, yeah. And the second center of learning? Which town or city?
in Medina.
Medina. Yeah, so Kufa and Medina. In Kufa, which main Sahabi?
Abdullah ibn
Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, good. Yeah. And in Medina, we had, anyone remember the names? Zayd ibn Thabit, Aisha, and Abdullah ibn Umar. Yeah, and these were the main ones, but obviously there were much more. Okay, this is to do with hadith preservation. I'm not going to go into that now. Okay, so let's go on to our next slide. Okay. Okay, so that was the whole purpose of that was not to actually teach you the names of companions. The whole purpose of that was just to show right from the earlier onset, the different mindsets when it comes to fiqh came from the Sahaba themselves. And right early on, there were other centers of learning, but two main centers of learning were Kufa and Medina. Kufa were known as the people of opinion, yeah.
Mm.
And Medina was the people of
Hadith.
hadith, yeah, hadith. That's the Kufan, yeah. Okay, so that's basically, if you just remember those two sentences from the last page, then that's good enough. Okay, and the Maliki madhab was formed in Medina, by the way, because Imam Malik, he was the Imam of Medina, and that's where the Maliki madhab was formed. And in Iraq, which madhab was formed? Well, in Kufa,
Hanafi.
the Hanafi madhab, yes. Okay. Now, where does the Shafi madhab come from? We're not going to get into that. Okay, so by the 4th century, basically Islamic century, Hijrah, the world had split into the Hanafis, Shafis, Malikis, Hanbalis, and so on. Yeah, but right from the early on, there was no such thing as Hanafis and Shafi because these people hadn't even been born yet. Yeah.
So do you know you said like the foundation was 40 AH?
Yeah.
What about when Imam Abu Hanifa, what year was he sort of around?
He was born 80 AH.
So okay.
He's not born yet. Yeah. So in this period, which I just discussed, right from the early on, from let's say after the Khulafa Rashidin period, after 40 AH, the madhabs weren't affiliated to any individual, they're affiliated to regions. So the Iraq was the Iraqi school. Yeah, and Medina was the Hijazi school. That's what they were known as. Even if you go to the earliest books of fiqh, they wouldn't say the Hanafi school says this. Sometimes they would, but other times they'd say the Iraqi school. Even if they're talking about the Hanafi school, they just the natural terminology to use was this is the view of the Iraqi school, or this is the view of the Hijazi school. So these were basically regional schools. Kufa was the Iraqi school, and Hijaz was the Hijazi school. Makkah and Medina was the Hijazi school, and that's what they were. Okay, and that's what they referred to as. They became personal schools attributed to a single person much later on, much later. But anyway, so that's by the 4th century. People start seeing it as a Hanafi thing rather than an Iraqi thing. So basically, Hanafi fiqh is a preservation of the Iraqi school. Yeah. So it wasn't that Imam Abu Hanifa came out one day and he became his next level overnight and started teaching people. No, he basically studied from the Iraqi scholars and preserved that knowledge for the later generation. Because he was the main scholar of the time, it was just attributed to him by chance. Not by chance, because he was one of the great scholars, but he was basically a preservation of the Iraqi school. And Imam Malik was a preservation of the Medinan school. Yeah. So anyway, so that's why it says the first form was in the shape of Ashab al-Ra'y and Ashab al-Hadith. That's within the Sahaba. Yeah, it started from within the Sahaba. When they were living together, some Sahaba would be more inclined towards opinion, some Sahaba were more inclined towards Ra'y. And when they separated into different territories, that's when their things started coming out. Okay, and so we've mentioned this before. Not all the Sahaba were muftis, by the way. If you're to count how many Sahaba actually gave fatwa that we have preserved, it was about 130. So imagine so many Sahaba, and this was going back to our first session now, is they wouldn't give fatwa. Yeah, Sahaba, they refused to give fatwa. Even if you went to one of the most knowledgeable Sahabi for a fatwa, first thing you do is go ask him. Yeah, when you go to him, he'd be like, no, go ask him, he's more knowledgeable. They would refuse to give their own opinion in case they was wrong. Okay. So Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah, he says from amongst the Sahaba, there were 7 that were most active in giving fatwa. One was Umar radiallahu anhu. Some Tabi'in actually consider Uthman radiallahu anhu as well in those 7 to make it 8. So Umar radiallahu anhu was very active, Ali radiallahu anhu, Aisha radiallahu anha, Zayd ibn Thabit, Abdullah ibn Abbas, Abdullah ibn Umar, and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. So they were generally seen as the 7 Sahaba that were very active in giving fatwa. Those from the middle category include Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu and Uthman radiallahu anhu, because they just hesitate to give their own opinion on things. And then from those companions that there's 1 or 2 fatwas that are narrated from them, that's in the hundreds and hundreds. That's like in the hundreds, yeah. So because there's only 130 Sahaba that there's fatwas narrated from. So if you were to, let's say, get the fatwa of Umar radiallahu anhu, take like 1 volume. Yeah, so you can gather all the fatwas of Umar in 1 volume, Ali radiallahu anhu in 1 volume, and so on. Okay. And many of the Tabi'in, they said that the knowledge of Islam spread throughout the world from these 4 companions. One was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, one was Zayd ibn Thabit, Abdullah ibn Abbas, and Abdullah ibn Umar. That's why as Muslims, we should know who these companions were. Imagine these were the instrumental figures of knowledge coming back to us, but we have no idea who these people were. Yeah, which is very sad. And one of the main purposes of this course is to generally make the average person, what's the word, literate. Yeah, that's the right word, to make the average person literate in when it comes to fiqh. Because right now, generally when it comes to the sciences of Islam, we're illiterate, where we have no idea. We just a few things from hearsay. But that's one of the main purpose of this course, is to make us literate when it comes to understanding what fiqh is. But anyway, so these 4 companions are very important. We should remember their names: Ibn Mas'ud, Zayd ibn Thabit, Ibn Abbas, and we have Ibn Umar. These are 4 main companions that knowledge spread from. Ibn Mas'ud was obviously in which city? Kufa. They had Zayd ibn Thabit in Medina. Ibn Abbas. I haven't said his name yet. It's the first time his name has come. He was the main scholar of Makkah. Ibn Abbas. Yeah. So there were 2 different schools though. Medina was one school and Makkah was another school. But they had many different companions residing in both. Different, yeah. But Ibn Abbas, he was what was in relation to the Prophet ﷺ?
His uncle. No.
This is Ibn Abbas.
Then his nephew.
Cousin. Yeah.
Cousin.
So Abbas was the Prophet's uncle, his father's brother, Abbas, and his son was Ibn Abbas. His name was Abdullah. Yeah, Ibn means son, isn't it? Yeah, his name was Abdullah, the son of Abbas. Yeah, and then you have obviously Abdullah, the son of Mas'ud, Abdullah, the son of Umar. Okay, but anyways, yeah, so he's in Makkah. Okay, Ibn Khaldun, one of the greatest historian in Islam. So he writes that the companions were on different level in terms of the understanding of Deen. Not all companions were the same. So this is why Ibn Khaldun, he says that knowledge of Deen is not taken from all the Sahaba. Knowledge of Deen is taken from a few selected of the companions, of the ulama amongst them. And so knowledge of Deen is taken from the ulama, the scholars of the Sahaba, because not all of them are scholars. Many of them only had basic knowledge of Deen. Some Sahaba, they came to the Prophet ﷺ, stayed with him for a few days. The Prophet taught them the 5 pillars, how to pray Salah, and sent them back. So that's all they knew about Islam for their entire lives. Yeah, many Sahaba couldn't dedicate that much time towards teaching and learning. Imagine you've got your job, you've got your family, and so imagine, let's say you have your local imam. How much time does an average person spend with the local imam? You go to work, you spend some time with your family, you speak to your local imam whenever you can, sit with him maybe, sometime in the day, and that's it, you go home. Yeah, Sahaba were the same. They had jobs to do, they had so many other things to do. Yeah, so that's why not all Sahaba spent so much time. Not all Sahaba spent so much time with the Prophet ﷺ. Even, let's say, such a great companion like Umar radiallahu anhu, he had to take turns with his neighbor. Umar radiallahu anhu was such a great companion. He would say to his neighbor that, let's take turns. I'll work one day and you spend the day with the Prophet ﷺ. Next day you work and I'll spend the day with the Prophet ﷺ. And then what happens is, whatever I've learned on your work day, I'll narrate that back to you. And whatever I've missed on my work day, you narrate that back to me. So that's what the Sahaba had to do. Some Sahaba were free to spend the entire time with the Prophet, like Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. So he was very wealthy before Islam came. Yeah. So when after Islam, he used all of his wealth gradually to support him, to support the Prophet ﷺ, and so on. Yeah. Some like Abu Hurairah, you had the Ashab al-Sufa that were they were extremely poor and just live, eat, sleep, everything in the masjid. So that's why Abu Hurairah, he was one of the main people in Ashab al-Sufa. That's why he's narrated the most hadith, because he could spend so much time memorizing hadith because he didn't have any job. But not all Sahaba were like that. So there were few who understood the deen fully. There were few. They knew ins and outs of the deen, the reasons, the wisdoms of everything. Yeah. And he says there are about 20 companions in the middle category. And then they said more than 103rd category. They understood the deen, yes, they were, but not as much. Yeah. Okay. So that's why, okay, so knowledge of deen comes from Ibn Mas'ud, Zayd, Ibn Abbas, and Ibn Umar. And Aisha radiallahu anha was very influential as well. She was one of the main muftis of the time. So what we're going to do next is we'll start it with Aisha. We're not going to go into, basically we're going to go through the biographies, not biographies in the whole life, but at least we know something to do with the knowledge. So when I was going through the biographies, I just took out those things which were related to their knowledge, and I left out other things because we just want here, the purpose of this is to learn how they affected fiqh, not to learn, everything about them. So we're going to go through one or two companions and then we'll end there, inshallah. Okay, so first we're going to start off with, ideally I should have started with Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu and then Umar radiallahu anhu, because obviously they were the most knowledgeable companions. But Umar radiallahu anhu, we already know bits about Abu Bakr, we already know bits of Umar radiallahu anhu. That's why I'm going to skip them because they're famous, everyone knows about them generally. So Aisha radiallahu anha is a person, generally, we've heard that she was very knowledgeable. We don't really know any details, basically. So she was born in Makkah, in the Meccan period, after the Prophet became a prophet. Yeah, so she was very young when the Prophet in his prophet, basically. And then she passed away at the age of 64 in 57th year after Hijrah. Whose reign is this? This is the reign of Muawiyah radiallahu anhu. When did Muawiyah's reign end? 60 or 61, I believe. Because in the 41 AH, Muawiyah became Khalifa after Khulafa Rashidin, and his reign was about 20 years. Okay, so she was the daughter of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, the closest companion of the Prophet and wife of the Messenger of Allah. And generally, all the scholars unanimous that she is the afqah, which is the most knowledgeable in fiqh of the women of the entire ummah. Yeah, she is the most knowledgeable in fiqh. Yeah. And they say ala al-itlaq, they say mutlaqan, like by default, basically. There's no one, you can't compare anyone to her. But let's say when it comes to men companions, there can be comparison. Okay, you know what, this companion might be more knowledgeable than him. But when it comes to the women, she's default the most knowledgeable. The Messenger of Allah married her approximately 10 months before migration. And then she migrated with her parents. Okay, so she married the Prophet in the Meccan period, right before migration. Then she migrated to Medina, and then the marriage was consummated in the second year. So she passed. So when the Prophet passed away, she was about 18 years old when the Prophet passed away. So she lived most of her life after the Prophet passed away. Whereas the Sahaba, the other companions, were very old. So they lived most of their life in the lifetime of the Prophet and in a period of Jahiliyyah. She never saw the period of Jahiliyyah. She wasn't even born then. She was born into Islam. So that's why she played a very, very important role in preserving knowledge. And that's why she was one of the greatest muftis that all the Sahaba would come to her to ask her questions. So she passed on an enormous amount of knowledge from the Messenger, as well as her father. Her father was none of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. And she also narrated knowledge from Umar, Fatima, and many other great companions. And she had many students who narrated from her. Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib will come to who these people were. Right now, these people are just names, but inshallah, by the end of the course, we'll put some attributes to these names. So her students were Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib. He was the most knowledgeable of the tabi'een. We had Tawus, Ashab, Urwa, Ata ibn Abi Rabah, Ikrimah, Al-Qama, and so on. Yeah. So she had many students. There's a Musnad attributed to her, which has 2,000. She narrated just over 2,000 hadiths from the Prophet ﷺ. And okay, so her nikah was decided by Allah. So nikah was done when the Prophet was shown a dream, wasn't it? And Jibreel came to the Prophet and said that she is going to be your wife. So this was one of the virtues that Aisha had over other wives of the Prophet ﷺ. And just this statement, she demanded immediate justice for the killing of Uthman and led her own group. So that's when the fitna happened between when Uthman was assassinated. So she's one of her, Talha, and others. Basically, they started their own group and said, we demand justice. So, and they actually opposed Ali radiallahu anhu. And the companions would come to learn from her, and they'd study under her. So one tabi, Masruq, he says, قلنا له هل كانت عائشة تحسن الفرائض. So someone asked about Aisha, that was she good at inheritance? And then the tabi says, والله لقد رأيت أصحاب محمد الأكابر يسألونها عن الفرائض. He says, I swear by Allah, I saw the elite of the companions. This was talking about, the greatest companions going to her as a student and asking her about inheritance. And another tabi says, لقد صحبت عائشة فما رأيت أحدا قط كان أعلم بآية أنزلت ولا بفريضة ولا بسنة ولا بشيء ولا أروى له ولا بيوم من أيام العرب ولا بنسب ولا and so on and so on. Basically, he says, I accompanied Aisha and I've not seen anyone more knowledgeable regarding any verse that was revealed, regarding inheritance, regarding the sunnah, even regarding poetry. Neither about nasab is, your genealogy and where you come from and so on. Basically, and then he said of many other things. Then he even said medicine. I've not seen anyone more knowledgeable than her. Then the person he was saying this to, he was confused, said, okay, I understand fiqh and hadith and verses. Where did she get medicine from? She's never studied medicine. So how is she more knowledgeable in medicine? And he says, فَقُلْتُ لَهِ يَا خَالَ الطِّبُّ مِنْ أَيْنَ عُلِّمْتِ. Then basically he asked the same question to Aisha. He said, okay, because Aisha was his aunt basically. He said, how did you learn medicine? And then Aisha basically said that, whenever the Prophet would become ill, people would come and, they'd give him medicine advice, and I'd actually memorize all these things. So over my lifetime, I just literally sat with doctors and listened to them and understood basically how medicine works. And that's how she learned this. And then Zuhri, one of the famous tabi'in, he says, or I think it's from the Sigar tabi'in actually, لو جمع علم عائشة إلى علم جميع النساء لكان علم عائشة أفضل. That if the knowledge of Aisha was compared to the knowledge of the entire women that exist in their time, then her knowledge would be a lot greater. Actually, here it says she passed away in the reign of Marwan. I'll have to double check that if that's correct. Actually, no, sorry, yes. She died in 64. And Muawiyah, I said his rule was until?
About 20 years.
Yeah, so 41 to 60, yeah. So Marwan, yeah, that's correct, sorry. Passed away in the reign of Marwan, yes. And, okay, and she's buried in the night, and her janazah was led by Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. Okay, so we're coming on to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, but I think we'll just finish there. Okay, so we're coming into Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, which is a long, we've got quite a lot about him, a lot. Okay, so we're not going to go into Abdullah ibn Mas'ud today. We'll save that for next lesson. So today, what did we discuss? We discussed the split. What was the split?
Medina and Kufa.
Medina and Kufa. Medina was known as?
People of Hadith.
People of Hadith. Kufa was known as?
People of opinion.
People of opinion. Yeah. And then we discussed that Ibn Mas'ud was in Kufa, and we had the other companions in Medina, and the mindset stemmed from the Sahaba. So due to difference in the mindset of the Sahaba, that was carried on to the next generation. That's what we discussed today, isn't it? And then we discussed that how many Sahaba's fatwas recorded from? About 130, and 7 are from the Ibn Qayyim says Mukthirin, that were constantly given fatwa, and there were a few from the middle, and Uthman. Yeah, some people actually put Uthman in the first category, but yeah. And then we had many from the whose 1 or 2 fatwas are recorded from. And then we discussed that deen is not taken from all the Sahaba, but a few from amongst them. You have elite of the Sahaba. Yeah, actually, what I'll finish with today, I'm just going to discuss for about 1 or 2 minutes without going into the biographies. Just one thing I think would be good to mention and leave it on that. Okay, yeah. So now which companions in which places? So this is quite important. Okay, so in Medina, we had Zayd ibn Thabit, Ibn Umar and Aisha. Yeah, we've got that. In Makkah, first it was Mu'adh ibn Jabal, and then and then later it was Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu. So Ibn Abbas was seen as the main teacher of Makkah, Abdullah ibn Abbas. And in Iraq was Ali ibn Mas'ud. In Basra was Abu Musa Ash'ari. I believe he was put there by Umar radiallahu anhu. Basically one of the, Umar or Uthman. So he was sent there as a governor. So Abu Musa Ash'ari, he wasn't like the elite of the Sahaba, but he was very, very knowledgeable of the Sahaba. So he was in Basra. Anyone know where Basra is? Basra was right next to Kufa, basically. There were two cities. Yeah. So Kufa was there and Basra would be about here. Yeah, in Iraq. And they had, for the first 100 years, there was Hanafi fiqh, and Basran fiqh was separate to the Hanafi fiqh. And later on, they basically merged in together when Hanafi fiqh basically expanded, and there was just the Basran fiqh was absorbed. But basically, Basra had their own school for quite a long time, and their knowledge came from Abu Musa Ash'ari and Anas ibn Malik and some others, and they were put there in the reign of Umar and Uthman as governors. And then you had Sham. Sham is Syria, that area, Lebanon, Palestine, that area. So Abu Darda was the main scholar of Sham, and I believe he resided, where did he reside? Yeah, in Damascus. He was the Qadi, the main judge, the judge of Damascus. That's Abu Darda. And then you had Mu'adh, who resided in Palestine, Philistine, Mu'adh ibn Jabal. And then you had Ubadah ibn Samit in a place called Hims. So in Sham, you had many companions as well. And these were the main companions that spread their knowledge there. And Egypt, the conqueror of Egypt was none other than Amr ibn al-As. Yeah, so he was the conqueror of Egypt, wasn't he? Yeah, in whose reign? Umar radiallahu anhu's reign. That's when Egypt was conquered. Yeah, so he went and resided there afterwards. That's why many of his students, basically a lot of the narrations of Amr ibn al-As come from Egypt in that area. Yeah. And Palestine was conquered in whose reign? Umar radiallahu anhu's reign as well. That's that famous story, him and his slave taken to the camel. So Egypt, Palestine, Damascus, these were all conquered in the time of Umar.
Send somebody to give in, I can't remember. I think I can't remember now actually, but then he went there and then I mentioned the name, I can't remember.
Yeah, so these were basically, because of these Sahaba, and we mentioned in previous knowledge that Sahaba had different amounts of knowledge, isn't it? Some Sahaba had hadith, some Sahaba didn't. Some Sahaba had greater understanding, some Sahaba had less of an understanding. Some Sahaba were with the Prophet 24/7, so they were learning a lot more. Some Sahaba were with him sometimes. So these different Sahaba, with their different amounts of knowledge, different mindsets, different methodologies, different understanding, they scattered within the reign of the Khulafa Rashidin. And that's why it was so important to understand the reign of the Khulafa Rashidin and what exactly happened there. And now they became their teachers, main teachers, and who the Tabi'in are turning to. And when they realize that the Sahaba are passing away, or they're going to pass away and our time with them is limited, what do you think the Tabi'in are going to do? They rush to them. They gathered all their fatwa, they gathered all their hadith, they gathered everything. Now these treasures of knowledge, so basically Basra becomes a center of learning. Medina becomes a center based on their companions. Makkah becomes a center based on their companions. Iraq and Egypt and Sham, but out of all of them, the two greatest centers were Kufa and Medina. So next lesson, we're going to start off by going through biographies of three of these Sahaba and understanding who these Sahaba were, and then we're going to go into the formation of the madhab next session. So how did who were the main scholars in Medina? How did it turn into a madhab, and so on and so on and so on. So we'll finish there. Any questions about anything before we stop the recording? Inshallah. So one message from one of the attendees, inshallah. Okay, any other questions before we stop?